Good day, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to a conversation with researchers about new FRPN outcome measures for non-resident fathers webinar. All lines have been placed on a listen-only mode, and the floor will be open for questions and comments following the presentation. If you should require assistance throughout the conference, please press *0 to reach a live operator. At this time, it is my pleasure to turn the floor over to your host, Jessica Pearson. Ma'am, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and welcome. This is the fourth webinar that Fatherhood Research and Practice Network has sponsored, and we're delighted today to focus on new outcome measures for non-resident fathers. Very briefly, FRPN is co-directed by Temple University and the Center for Policy Research in Denver, Colorado. Jay Fagan, Rebecca Kaufman, Nancy Thonis, and myself, and we have a terrific array of fatherhood researchers and practitioners who have helped with formulating the structure and mission of FRPN, and the Bauman Group provides marketing assistance and helped us develop the website. We've also worked with Vivian Gatson of the National Center on Fathers and Families. For those of you who have new to these webinars, FRPN is a 5-year, actually cooperative agreement with Temple University and Center Policy Research, funded through Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation, and our goal is to promote rigorous evaluation of fatherhood programs that serve low-income populations. We also provide training and technical assistance to researchers and evaluators to help them conduct better quality evaluations, and we try to disseminate information that leads to effective fatherhood practice. We have a comprehensive website, www.frpn.org, with research briefs, measures for low-income non-resident fathers, listserv where you can sign up so that you can be connected with researchers if you're a practitioner, and vice versa. An electronic newsletter, and we aim to work with a broad audience of programs, both OFA and non-OFA grantees, state-sponsored fatherhood commissions, programs linked to Head Start and Early Head Start, programs run by states and local child support and child welfare agencies, etc. We are now halfway through the project. We have another 2.5 years to go. One important thing we do is actually sponsor research. We fund projects to build the knowledge base about fatherhood practice and outcomes, and our first round of funded projects is shown here. They are all in progress, and they involve evaluating fatherhood interventions in home visiting, early childhood and Head Start program settings, reentry program settings, and a community-based fatherhood organization. We have another opportunity, another round of grants that we're going to be funding, and right now there is an RFP out. It's located on our website. We hope you will visit and consider this. Letters of interest are due on February 5th. So it's a 2-step process. Interested applicants submit a 3-page letter on February 5th, and we review them, and we then invite promising letter applicants to submit a full application, which is a 20-page write-up that is due in April 8th. We are interested in studies that focus on low-income, never married, and non-resident fathers. We are interested in rigorous evaluation designs, but have broadened it from our first round of RFPs. We're also interested in looking at replication studies or exploratory studies that systematically examine innovative approaches. Of course, we want studies that advance the fatherhood field and have strong research questions that promise to inform practice and future research. Our eligible applicants are really teams of researchers and fatherhood program practitioners. The application will come from one entity and the award will be made to one entity, but we are looking for teams where both researchers and practitioners are communicating and have informed the application process and will be conducting the study together. We are interested in supporting programs with and without OFA funding. So if you OFA grantees, if you are interested in or researchers, if you're interested in collaborating with OFA grantees and other entities, find each other and submit a letter. We are limited to working with programs based in the United States, located in the United States, and with non-institutionalized populations, that is, those not in prisons and jails and not in institutions where they really don't have mobility and some access to their children. We will entertain questions at the end of this webinar about the RFP, and also you can contact any one of us, but particularly Rebecca Kaufman, for questions about the RFP. Again, the letter of interest is due on February 5th. So we'll have this contact screen at the end of the webinar as well for you so that you can make further contact. So today's webinar deals with a conversation with researchers about FRPN outcome measures for non-resident fathers. As part of this project, we have worked on generating measures to address a variety of outcomes that we think are better attuned to the circumstances of non-resident, non-married fathers. And you'll be hearing more about measures of father-child contact, father engagement, decision-making and responsibility, father challenges, and in future weeks, we expect to also release a measure to assess co-parenting behaviors. We think those are going to be very relevant for future research that you would conduct about fatherhood programs and their outcomes. To help us do that today, we have a great panel. Jay Fagan, who is the co-director of the Fatherhood Research and Practice Network and a professor at Temple University. Rebecca Kaufman, who is the senior research coordinator for the network. And Justin Dyer, who is an assistant professor at Brigham Young University, where he works in the School of Family Life and the Religion Department. I'm going to turn the podium or the speaking slot over to Justin Dyer to start us off, and he's going to provide some background on measuring outcomes and tips on how to choose measures. So Justin, the floor is yours.
All right. Hey, thanks so much, Jessica. It's really been a pleasure for me to be associated with FRPN. The work that's being done is just fantastic, and it's been really exciting to see the kinds of measurement work that they're doing. Our measures really form the foundation of any research project, and so getting those right is really critical. If the measures are right, if the measures are wrong, I should say, we can have all other pieces of the study right, but if the measures aren't right, then we're not going to be able to do what we want to. So what I'm going to do here first is just present an overview of measures. How do we think about measures? How do we use measures? What's their role in the research process? And then later we'll get into more specifics on the measures that we've developed. So when we say measures, what do we actually mean here? What we mean is that we have a set of questions that tap into some aspect of the human experience, whether it be father involvement. It's one aspect that we're very interested in. So a variety of questions are asked there. How often, say, do you read to the child? How often do you help your child with homework? How often do you bathe the child? And we're not necessarily interested in each one of those questions in and of itself. We're not particularly interested in bathing in of itself, but asking a variety of questions that triangulate in onto this concept, this construct of father involvement. Another construct we're often interested in is child well-being, creating measures, asking questions about various aspects of child well-being, whether we want to know about internalizing problems of the child, where we ask questions like, is the child withdrawn? Is the child highly anxious? So that's what we mean when we say measure, that we're trying to get at some aspect that we really care about. So how do you go about selecting measures for your research project? Well, this really gets at then what theory do you have for your program? What do you think? Where do you think your program should have some impact on the participants? Do you think it should have an impact on the father's involvement? Should it have an impact on the child's well-being? Should it have an impact on the father-mother relationship or the father's knowledge of his child or child development? Where is it that you see your program having the most impact, and then selecting the measures that get at that particular aspect? Now, there's some tendency to say, well, our program should impact a lot of different things, but you do need to be selective, because that second bullet point points out there are time constraints here. We don't want to fatigue the participants. Gathering a lot of data can be good, but if it's not very good data, or if it's bad data because the participants have been fatigued, then the data isn't of any use to us. So we want to make sure that we select a short battery of questions that really get at what we think the program has the effect. Really more than 15 or 20 minutes, especially if they're filling this out just by themselves, becomes pretty difficult. And then also with that, when you select measures, you need to make sure that you select measures that have been validated for your particular population. Often the things that we're interested in manifest differently in different populations. We'll get into a little bit more of that again a little later as we talk about the non-resident resident fathers, but certainly father involvement manifests itself differently. And so one measure for one group might not work for another group. So we need to look at the measures to try and understand whether or not they apply to that population. Have there been any studies with those measures in that we have, and it often differs by high and low income individuals or by racial ethnic groups. So we need to understand our own population, the population that's served by the program, and see whether or not the measures that are being thought about used, whether or not they have been validated with that population. And just to note, when we say validation, what we mean is that is the measure that you've selected actually tapping into the experience that you want? Is your measure actually tapping into father involvement or into child well-being? And this is one of the great questions that researchers ask themselves, and people spend a lot of lot of time on is looking at measures to determine whether or not they are in fact tapping into that area that they want to tap into. And we validate measures by seeing how they relate to other validated measures, seeing how they relate to other constructs that should relate to that measure. There's more information about that as you might read on the process of how we validated our particular measures. So then it comes another question often is, well, can you adjust one of the measures? You have a measure, maybe it's 20 items. Can you make changes to that? Can you change the wording to the measure? Can you only use some of the items of the measure? Now, if there are aspects of that measure that don't make sense for your particular population, maybe there's a question within the measure, the 20 items, that just doesn't make sense for the population that you have, or if the wording wouldn't make sense to your population, then it is better to alter that measure so that it does make sense for your particular population. However, you have to be very cautious when you do this. You still need to ensure that you have validity of that measure. When you change the measure, you're changing slightly what it's measuring. And so you need to check to make sure that your measure is still getting at what you want it to. And also when you change the measure, you will likely lose the ability to compare your results with the results of others. And this is really a wonderful thing that we can do. If you have measures that are the same across studies, you can evaluate, you can see which studies or which programs are functioning better than others or function better for certain populations than others. So that's a really wonderful thing that we can do if people are using the same measure across different studies. And so if you're changing measures, then you likely lose the ability to compare results. So if you find that you have to change a measure, rather than changing the measure and going through the trouble to validate it and not being able to compare, you might see if there is another measure that can be used that's already been validated with your population. So if you feel like you have to change the measure, you might go back and try to see whether or not there might be another measure that you could use that would be even better. Now, these same cautions also go for creating your own measure. You still have to make sure that it has validity, that it has reliability. And also if you're using your own measure, nobody else is using it, then it's really hard to compare across different studies, which is often, again, very, very useful. Here's an important aspect of your measures. You want to make sure that there's variability in your measures. So some measures perform poorly because everybody responds the same. So, for example, if you ask fathers, how much do you love your child? If it's on a 10-point scale, almost everybody is going to select 10 or 9. So there's not going to be anything to predict there. There's not going to be any variability. You're not going to be able to say some people are higher, some people are lower. So it may be. So you need to make sure that there's sufficient variability there. That second question on there, how often do you take your child to school, might be a good one. That might have a lot of variability. Some dads take their some dads take their kids to school regularly. Other dads don't take their kids to school regularly. But there might be low variability on this if you're looking at, say, non-resident fathers. It might be that very few non-resident fathers are taking their children to school. So you might find that on that particular item that there's low variability. So what you need to do is examine the measure and perhaps even pilot the measure with some of the population you're looking at to make sure that there are a range of responses, that some people are high, some people are low, that not everybody is simply bunching up in one area. Now, going to analyzing the data, the critical question that will be asked here is change occurring? Does the program actually create some kind of change in the participants? And so this indicates that we need a pre and a post test. And you can analyze those in different ways. You can use a different score, simply subtract the initial score from the pre-score from the post-test score. You can also use regressions, controlling for prior levels. Those are two ways that are perfectly acceptable. You might actually do them both to see if there are any differences, and if so, then you can dig a little bit why. This is actually a fairly big statistical literature on which one you might use. But you could just keep that in your head as you start to do this. Also, you need to determine whether or not you allow for sufficient time to pass for there to be an effect of the program. If you think that your program will have an effect on child well-being, let's say that it's a fatherhood program, you get the father more engaged, and then that should lead to improved child well-being. Well, if at the end of a 6-week, 6-month program even, at the end of that, should the child well-being have improved? Or is it going to take a little bit longer for the child well-being to improve? Do you need to analyze further out from that? So it's really important that you get the measurement points right to determine where exactly are we going to have, should an effect appear? And then, of course, that last question there is how long do the program effects last? Do the program effects just last a couple weeks? Do they last a couple months? So getting that follow-up data is important to see at what point do you see the program effects maybe tapering off, or do the program effects continue strong for quite some time? So that's my portion of it, and I'll turn it over now to Jay to talk about the new measures.
Yeah, thank you, Justin. So I'm going to talk about the development and testing of our new measures. I'm also going to say a few words about the specific new measures that we have developed and where to find them. One of the goals of the Fatherhood Research and Practice Network is to assist researchers and practice programs with developing new measures and identifying already existing ones that could be used in the field. So one of our first steps was to determine which measures folks are using and which measures they are satisfied with and which measures they're not satisfied with. This involved first identifying what are some of the most commonly used outcome measures, and a list of these, although not all measures can be found in the slide. We then collected information. We asked researchers and practitioners about what are the deficiencies in some of those existing measures. And what we heard was that some of the measures that were being used in the field are indeed not very appropriate for non-resident unmarried fathers. For instance, current measures of father involvement with children typically include response choices. That would be the answers that you can give when answering a question, and that they applied to fathers who see their children on a daily basis, that the already existing measures are really more appropriate for fathers who live with their children. Well, low-income non-resident fathers often see their children several times per month or maybe less, and so that type of measure with a set of response choices that only asks about behaviors during a given week may not be sensitive enough to measure the non-resident father's involvement. As Justin said, there has to be some variability in the measure. If everybody is answering that they have very little involvement, then it's not a good measure. We also noticed that some of the current measures of father involvement focus on children within a specific and very limited age range. So they may address fathers with infants, fathers with preschoolers, fathers with adolescents. Yet many of the fatherhood programs serve fathers with children across the developmental spectrum. And so practitioners were telling us, and researchers were telling us, that they don't have that the measures that they're using just aren't appropriate for some of the age groups. Switch the slide here. Now, in the area of co-parenting, we also heard some concerns. We conducted focus groups with a group of 71 fathers, and what we learned from the fathers themselves were that many of the same domains of co-parenting pertain to them that also pertain to fathers who live with the mothers of their children, live with their children. However, what was different was that the behaviors in these different domains are not always the same. So when I say domain, I'm talking about something like support, co-parenting alliance, gatekeeping. These are domains, or sometimes referred to as constructs, that you are probably familiar with. So the domains, constructs, were pretty much the same, but we noticed that some of the behaviors that pertain to those domains are not the same for non-resident fathers as they are for resident fathers. Just to give you an example, if you think about mother's gatekeeping of father involvement with children, the fathers in our focus groups reported that mothers sometimes did not allow the child to see the father. That was a pretty common occurrence shared with us by fathers. That gatekeeping behavior is not likely to occur among fathers who live together with the mothers of their children. And so, again, there's a similar domain, but the behaviors are slightly different. So what's this idea of having measures that are not necessarily, that may not be appropriate, has consequences. That's consequences for one's research. Inappropriate measures may not be sufficiently sensitive to detect changes in behavior or attitudes among fathers attending fatherhood programs. Also, the researcher and program may not be able to say what exactly they're measuring with precision. Validation, which is something that Justin has just talked about, helps us to ensure that a measure assesses what it proposes to measure. Just to give an example, in our development of a measure of father engagement with children, we found that fathers' play with kids fit very closely with their caregiving and physical care for children. The idea is that that play didn't function as a separate measure; it combined with caregiving. And so, in our development of a measure, we have a scale called caregiving play. So, just to review again our process of developing new measures. As I said, we conducted focus groups with 71 low-income non-resident fathers from 9 responsible fatherhood programs, and that was 2 summers ago. We asked fathers to think about the ways in which they are involved with their child. We also asked them to think about their co-parenting relationships, how they work together with mothers and other relatives and other individuals in their network in regards to raising children together. Then in terms of father involvement, we took the activities that fathers mentioned most frequently, and we grouped them together. We put them into these domains. We had an educational psychologist review the items to identify developmentally appropriate items for specific age groups. And in terms of father involvement, we came up with 7 domains, and these included the list here. I won't read this to you. You can see them on the PowerPoint. Our next step after conducting the focus groups and then analyzing this data was to create a measure based on the information we received from fathers, and then to administer that measure to a fairly large group of fathers. We validated the new measure with 640 fathers. 216 were from fatherhood programs, and another 424 fathers were from high poverty, very similar neighborhoods as to where the fatherhood programs were located. Fathers were recruited from the community in different locations: grocery stores, barbershops, churches, some community agencies. This is other than the actual fatherhood programs. And we found indeed that the fathers in both of these groups were very similar. The majority were unemployed. About 40% of the fathers were unemployed. Most had a high school education or less and were low income. About 90% of the fathers did not live with at least one of their children. So in order to qualify for participation in the study, fathers were required to be at least 18 years of age and have at least one non-residential biological child between the ages of 1 month and less than 21 years of age. Now, based on the data that we collected from these 600 some odd fathers, we have been able to validate our new measures. We have a lot of confidence in these measures. They relate to other standard measures that have been used in the field, and they seem they have good they're good for predicting outcomes such as parenting self-esteem, child behavior outcomes, etc. The measures are that we currently have available can be found on our website. So I'm just going to go through these quickly. The first one is on decision-making responsibility. We have validated that measure, and you can find the measure as well as a brief video that reviews the measure on our website. The second is a measure of fathers' challenges or risks, and we also have a video on our website that describes the use of that measure. The third one is measuring father-child contact. I see that the word contact has been dropped off there, but it should read contact. Again, we have a video describing the measure. And the fourth one is father's engagement. That's available. Shortly, we'll have our measure of co-parenting, a brand new measure of co-parenting that's been validated with fathers, with non-resident low-income fathers, and that will be available hopefully by early February. You can find that on the website as well. The father engagement measure, incidentally, has 4 versions, one for fathers who have an infant, one for fathers of children between 1 and 6 years old, a measure of father engagement for fathers with kids 6 to 12, and then for adolescents. And we felt that was important because the kinds of things that fathers do with their children vary by age group. Okay, I'm going to turn the webinar over to Rebecca now.
Great. So let's talk a little bit about survey administration. There are disadvantages and advantages to each survey administration method. Let's start with talking about staff administered. A key advantage of staff or one-on-one administration is that it helps to ensure high-quality data. If a father doesn't understand a question, he could ask the staff person for clarification. Furthermore, if the father has limited reading comprehension, it can be useful for the father to hear the item read aloud. However, this strategy can be time-consuming for program staff. Self-administered is a common strategy, and it requires little staff time. A staff person gives the survey to a father, and then the father completes the survey on his own. The disadvantage is that sometimes the process of filling out a survey and then reading questions can produce fatigue, and folks may not answer questions correctly or really accurately. This is something really to consider. A third commonly used strategy is survey administration via telephone. This method is often used as a follow-up survey method. This strategy allows the father to complete the survey remotely, yet for fathers who have limited telephone access, it might prove to be challenging. Group format is sometimes used, where a staff person may read aloud each question to a group of fathers, and then fathers individually indicate their response option on their own survey. This can be really good for fathers with limited reading comprehension, but sometimes if a participant does not understand a question, he may be concerned with asking the question in front of the group for fear of disclosing personal information. Finally, administration through computer program requires, of course, computers or an electronic device, which fathers can use to take the survey. This can require, of course, upfront costs, but if a program uses a computer program, it can reduce the amount of staff time, as staff won't need to input answers from the paper survey later. Let's move to talk about frequency of survey administration. This is often a question that programs have. It's really a two-part question, and Justin also touched on this briefly, which is 1, how frequently should surveys be administered, and 2, when should they be administered? A program may want to consider the more than once method, and this is because administering a survey at the beginning of the program and at the end enables a program to compare one point in time to another. This way, it is possible to determine any possible change in fathers' responses from time 1 to time 2. A slightly more laborious method is to administer the survey to fathers not once, not twice, but 3 times. This allows the researcher to examine the lasting change of a program over time. A program or researcher can compare the aggregate of these 3 separate surveys to then assess change over a longer period of time. As is mentioned before, some programs opt to use telephone calls as the method for their 3rd survey administration. If a program is interested in using a follow-up telephone call method, it's really important to fully prepare to ensure success. Programs should consider collecting detailed contact information about their participants at the beginning of the program, and then keep updated information throughout the program to ensure the fathers have multiple accurate numbers. It's often useful to have a staff person who the father knows and has a relationship with to help collect the information. Programs should try to get really several points of contact information, such as maybe the father's cell phone number, his home phone number, his email address, as well as maybe the mother's number, his brother's number, or best friend's number. Sometimes programs might ask fathers to share the best way to get in contact if he's not reachable through his primary contact number. I would really encourage programs to set up a Facebook page and make connections with fathers previous to the follow-up call attempts. This way, when it comes time to make the call, a line of communication is already open. If the program is having difficulty reaching the father through his cell phone or other contact number, you'd be able to then reach out via Facebook and obtain a more up-to-date number. It's useful to train a staff person to help with the telephone interviewing and to have a script that's already outlined for that program person to use to then encourage fathers to take the telephone survey. You may also choose to provide the staff person with a mobile phone so that interviews can be completed during out-of-the-office hours when fathers may be more available. On this note, it's important that the staff person who makes the call attempts calls at varied times to try to make contact with the father. Changing the day or time of the call and calling at various points of the day helps to increase the likelihood of contact with that father. On that note, I'm going to turn over to our operator so we can begin our Q&A portion.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, the floor is now open for questions. If you do have a question, please press star 1 on your telephone keypad at this time. If you're using a speakerphone, we ask that while posing your question, you pick up your handset to provide favorable sound quality. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, if you do have a question or comment, please press star 1 on your telephone keypad at this time. Please hold as we poll for questions.
I'm going to nip in with a question while everyone dials in, and ask our panelists if there are any rules about when you should ask certain questions in an interview, and when and question sequencings that should be avoided. Are there any rules of thumb about this? Justin, what advice can you give us?
Well, the more sensitive questions you often want to ask a little bit later on in the survey, maybe even ask them at the end. And sensitive questions are even things such as the person's income, other kind of background characteristics. When participants get sensitive questions right up front, it can put them off a bit from the rest of the survey, make them a bit suspicious. But if they answer a lot of questions initially that are pretty innocuous, nothing too sensitive, it gets them in a good spot to be able to answer. Then later, some of the more sensitive questions. Whereas leading with those can be a bit of an issue on how they'll respond to the rest of the survey.
Jessica, can I add something there?
Yeah, go for it, Jay.
Sure. So sometimes folks may think that it's okay to ask about, for instance, employment where the person works at the beginning of an interview. And I would strongly suggest that the survey questions about employment be placed towards the end of the survey. Otherwise, fathers tend to think that all we're interested in is that father as a provider, and not in his role as an involved father who takes care of his child, spends time with him, and is engaged with the child. So I would suggest placing the employment questions towards the end. They're not typically real sensitive questions, but they can convey a message that that's really what the researcher and the program is interested in, rather than the father's involvement with the child.
Rebecca, are there some kinds of questions that you find fathers struggle to answer with, that they're more confusing, that where they require help?
Certain questions like establishing which is the target child sometimes produces challenges for fathers, especially when fathers have multiple children. That's often helpful for the staff person to work through with the father who the target child will be for the rest of the survey.
Okay. And again, what about if when you involve mothers in data collection as well? How do you deal with different responses about the same events by different respondents, mothers' accounts, fathers' accounts? Is that something our programs and researchers are going to come up against, and what do you recommend?
Do you want me to address that?
Sure, go for a start with it, Jay.
Okay. So if you're collecting both mother and father data, I think a first principle is try to measure some of the same things. Use the same constructs. So, for instance, if you're assessing the co-parenting relationship, use the same measure of co-parenting with the mother as you do with the father. Now, you may have to change the word he or she or him or her, but those are very minor changes, and they don't usually change the meaning of the questions. But try to use the same measure, and it's really valuable to include both mother and father assessment of things like co-parenting or relationship quality, conflict, etc., or even measures of child behavior, because mothers and fathers often have different perceptions of these issues, and we want to see if their perceptions are similar, if they're different. Now, you can include both of their information in analyzing the data. You can include both mother and father co-parenting assessments, for instance, in the same study, and that provides really very valuable information. If you find, for instance, that father's perceptions of the co-parenting relationship changes but not mother's, that tells you something about maybe how the program is functioning, how it's working.
Does anybody else want to add something to this about multiple responses to similar questions? Okay. Do we have any questions?
Yes, we do, Jessica. But once again, that's star one if you do have a question. And our first question comes from Gloria Andre from Teaneck Health. Please state your question.
No, and my question is if these measures have been validated with Latino population, and also in addition to that, if you have contemplated any of qualitative studies or doing measurements for these kind of studies.
Yep, maybe I can address that. So yes, thank you for asking that question. That's really an important question. We made a decision early on not to start with validating the measures with fathers in the Philadelphia area, and not to specifically seek out a group of Latino fathers. But there is a great need to do that. Most of the fathers who participated in our study, in this validation study, were African American, but there were Hispanic fathers in the sample, but we just didn't have the resources, unfortunately, to collect a large sample of Hispanic fathers. That would be a next step. We absolutely must try to validate our new measures, or other folks should do the same with their measures with Hispanic, Hispanic fathers and mothers.
Right, and this may be something also that Child Trends may be doing with their with a different OPRI grant, right, that deals with Hispanic fathers and families.
Mm-hmm.
So that's another resource to definitely consult. That might be a possibility again that's something that research practitioner team might propose for FRPN funding. That would be a type of study that would be of interest to the network, and again, submit a letter of interest, and let us consider that.
Okay, thank you.
Once again, star one if you do have a question or comment.
Let me just real quick address that part about the qualitative that was mentioned. That's a really great component in evaluation work, is to get the feedback in a qualitative way from the participants. Now, just doing the qualitative, it's also important to follow that up then with a quantitative assessment to see if you're seeing the same kinds of things come out when you actually test the hypotheses with the statistics. So having qualitative and quantitative is really valuable when an evaluation is done, having both of those combined. But just qualitative, it would also, at least for me, I would say, be important to do the quantitative component as well.
Thank you, and we have a few more questions. And our next question comes from Anthony Stevenson from People's Unified Research Center. Please state your question.
Yes. Being formerly the Assistant Director of the Mayor's Office of Community Service, developing the Fatherhood Initiative program at least over a decade ago, there were questions that we used to ask at that particular time regarding their, cultural education and faith and religion. How is that addressed now going forward, as well as we've been doing a survey in our organization on childhood education in regard to their father and the children's education. How is that being addressed, or has that been addressed?
So you're asking about measures that may look at fathers, other characteristics of the father, religion.
Yes, cultural, because like I said, we're in 2004 and 3, we had a intense survey that we did, or when you were coming into the program with us, and it would ask, it was questions on there you could ask as far as whatever your faith, religion was, some of your cultural, because we had quite a number of African American and Hispanics, as well as Caucasians that came through the mayor's office that was actually under the street administration. And being the assistant director there with Gil Coleman, we addressed a lot of these activities. And now we've been working through People's Unified Resource Center with our Fathers in Education Division in Pennsylvania, Atlanta, and Connecticut, where we've been doing a survey based on the education level of the parent as well as the children. So is that something that has been measured on your end, or something?
Yeah. Okay. So what kind of intended measures? What are the characteristics of fathers that this seminar webinar has been focused on outcome measures, but what are the important independent variables, characteristics of fathers that should be included in any kind of a robust study, and what did you do in developing these measures? I guess this is Jay again, yes?
Measures of education, there are lots of measures of educational achievement. We didn't, that doesn't mean that they're necessarily excellent or great measures of educational achievement or involvement. But Anthony, we didn't take that on as part of our developmental work, probably because we thought that there are fairly good measures out there already. As far as the religious involvement, spirituality, I think that's a great that would be a great contribution to take a look at some of those measures and see if they are sensitive to the population that's being served by fatherhood programs, and maybe develop some measures. They could potentially be important outcome measures as well. For instance, do particularly let's say fathers who are participating in faith-based types of interventions, does their participation have some effect on some aspect of their spiritual development or something of that nature? We didn't take it on. There's only so much that we felt we could do, so we just had to set some limits. There's so many things that could be measured, and you just can't do it all.
I guess, Justin, are there some standard types of independent measures or father characteristics that you'd like to see, or that sort of must include in surveys and studies of outcomes that you think people should be aware of?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, all the demographic factors are of course going to be important. Religiosity, religious affiliation is not used, hardly at all. If you look at the research on fatherhood and religiosity, there's very, very little on that. I would think that those kinds of characteristics might serve as moderators. And this is an important point, that when we're evaluating programs, it's often not does the program work or not, but for whom does it work? For whom does it work more? Does it work better for fathers with certain religious backgrounds or certain background characteristics? I'm trying to think of anything that would be essential to add in there. I think something we didn't touch on too much is, the amount of contact, period, that the father has with the child is really important. How do you measure that? That's something that you're going to definitely want to have in there, because that is going to moderate probably anything that you do. So the effect of your program is probably going to be different depending on the level of contact the father actually has with the child.
Thank you.
Thank you. And our next question comes from Cheryl Marcus from Harvard Mac Group. Please state your question.
Hi, yes. I was wondering whether or not if there is an opportunity for replicating your research with fathers who come from rural or small cities, since, as I understand, most of your work has been done in large urban communities. But what about the studies of fathers from rural or small communities, which is where I live?
Yeah, great point. Yes, there would be some interest and some need in replicating these measures with fathers in rural communities. I probably should have mentioned that some of our fathers actually did come from rural communities. We collected data in, Rebecca, where was it? It was at Auburn University?
That's correct, yes.
Which is located
in Alabama.
Alabama, yes, thank you.
Yeah.
I always get that confused. So we had part of the sample came from rural Alabama near Auburn University. We also collected some of our data from Scranton, Pennsylvania, which is a very rural, small-town community. And Rebecca, any place else that
some smaller communities in New Jersey as well.
Mm-hmm. So it was not totally an urban. When I said Philadelphia, what I meant was most of it came from Philadelphia and the Philadelphia region, but we also collected data from New York City, so it was a pretty wide, data collection.
So there is indeed an opportunity for replicating your research in these areas beyond those areas that you've already that you've identified.
Yes, definitely. And our measures are available, online. You don't have to pay for them. There's not, we're not publishing them, but they are available. So you can take those measures and use them as you see fit. You're more than welcome to use them. We have. I don't know if I mentioned also that the documentation for the measures, the validation documentation, is available. Just email us or call us, and we'll send it to you.
Thank you very much.
We're hoping that in this new round of research that the federal government will be sponsoring through the Office of Family Assistance, there will be some opportunity for local evaluators to augment the performance measures and use some of these outcome measures. And that's how we'll build up the knowledge base if in different program settings and with different populations we use some of these same measures and see whether they resonate and yield the same kind of results across different programs and settings. So that's part of the plan. Hope you will consider that.
Yeah. And also, please give us feedback about the measures. If you have some reactions to the measures, we really would welcome your feedback.
Thank you.
And once again, that's *1 if you do have a question or comment.
Are there any others in the queue right now? Because I can nip in with one if...
Please go ahead.
Okay. Justin, you alluded to father-child contact. That wasn't the subject of today's presentation, but we do have a measure about father-child contact and some wisdom, I think, on ways to measure contact that might represent an improvement over some of the traditional measures. Again, Jay, do you want to talk a little bit about what we've learned about measuring contact?
Sure. So one thing that we learned is that it's really important to measure contact that's not face-to-face. So, for instance, we have in our measure of father-child contact, we have one item that asks fathers how often they have telephone contact, contact by email, by text, by FaceTime, by other forms of social media. And we have found that the non-resident fathers have a lot of contact through those different mechanisms, and we think it's very important to include that measure. I recently had a conversation with someone who's implementing a fatherhood program with fathers who have children in foster care, and they were really not sure what to measure. They were asking, what should we measure? Their funder actually challenged them about whether those fathers could even increase their amount of involvement with the child, because the kids are in foster care, and any involvement is supervised by the child welfare system. So they didn't see a possibility that fathers could increase their involvement. And I said, well, how about the telephone contact and other forms of social media contact? And the director of the program said, oh, yes, that really makes a lot of sense. Fathers, even if they're not able to have regular face-to-face contact that's unsupervised, they still can have telephone contact with their children. So we think that's really an important issue, type of involvement to measure. That's also really critical for fathers whose children are fathers who are in some type of incarceration situation. Jessica, was there another part to that question? Or
I think it does. It's but actually, father-child contact. We also have. We're looking at number. It does involve numbers of overnights, but also day contacts, and the measure that you've developed through this project looks at a little bit more robust range of in addition to social media contact, but different types of interpersonal contact, right?
So we also include, in our measure, we include a question about, how often the child spends nights with the father. And we think that's important to measure. In addition to just asking questions such as, do you live with the child all or most of the time, we have found that a certain proportion of fathers will say that they live with the child, that they do not live with the child all or most of the time, but then they'll tell us that they spend every night with the child. Now that sounds very contradictory, but we found, and we found this in our focus groups, that people have different definitions of what it means to live with a child. Not everybody perceives that, defines that in the same way. So we think it is important to ask about, for instance, how many nights the child spent with you or you spent with the child in the past 30 days, in the past month. So we strongly recommend that programs and evaluators include that kind of question, as well as include a question about, do you live with the child? Does the child live with you all or most of the time?
Okay.
And we do have another question.
Okay.
And it comes from Elias Jones from Prevention. Please state your question.
Yes, I just wanted to know if you guys had ever done any measurement in regards to, when that child or that parent contact might, be non-existent. Like what ages does that usually happen?
You mean total loss of contact?
Right.
Okay. Well, I don't think it's based on our research. I think there has been literature that shows as the child gets older, there's a strong drop-off in contact. There's a lot of more contact and involvement during infancy and first year of the life, and there's a dramatic drop-off over time. Does anybody on the panel want to amplify on contact literature?
If you don't mind, I'd like to respond to that. So it's really an interesting question. And Jessica, I think you're absolutely right that there is a drop-off if you look at sort of averages.
Yeah.
But we also know that, for fathers who are in programs, many of them are becoming reunited with their children, and those children may be adolescents. The children may be adults too. So they can be older children who suddenly see an increase in the father's contact and involvement with the child. Also, we have noticed that, at least in collecting data from the fatherhood programs, the responsible fatherhood programs, and of course there's some fatherhood programs that specifically work with young fathers who are going to tend to have younger children. But in the traditional responsible fatherhood programs, many of the fathers are not in their early 20s, they're in their 30s, in their mid-30s. We found a very wide range of ages of the fathers, which means that their children are older too. Right? I think that's because for these fathers, some of them are getting their lives together, and they're doing it at some point later in their lives, and they have some older children. And they may have several children, perhaps some that are young and some that are adolescents. I hope that sort of answers your question there.
Yes, that was very helpful. It's just that, due to some instances or with cultural reasons, sometimes different fathers are unable to see their children because of maybe the co-parent probably started a new relationship or new family.
Yes. Right.
For that child is, not given the time. And I just wanted to know if there was a certain age range or if that was even seen when you guys did your measurements.
No, but that would be an important, in terms of these moderator variables that Justin was alluding to, characteristics that you would try to collect about parents' fathers, you would and the other parent, you would want to know if they are involved in new relationships and they have new families. So those would be important things to collect, I think, in your questionnaire in order to assess outcomes.
Thank you.
And as a reminder, that's *1 if you do have a question or comment.
I want to ask if how the assessment of outcome measures can inform practice, and do we see evidence of that happening? We know that, well, when you write a funding proposal, you're going to be asked to do that. You want to be able to cite results of an evaluation study or promise to assess outcomes and make that a program more attractive to funders. But how do outcomes drive practice, or how might they drive practice? And have we seen any examples?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jessica. Justin, do you want to?
Yeah, can you say that? Just that one more time. I think I missed that just a bit there.
Oh, just the how evaluation outcomes and measurement, the results that we get on some of these outcome measures can affect practice. In actual fact, if they have from any studies that we're aware of, or how they might in the future. I know that we had a pretty dramatic one in building strong family studies, some studies of co-parenting where some negative impact outcomes were detected, and the clinical trial was actually stopped. So sometimes it can be the result can be pretty dramatic, but
yeah, absolutely. I think that is so important that we do this kind of work so that we can understand what impact we are having, and also so that we can identify groups of individuals. Again, going back to the idea of for whom is the program effective, not just is it effective, but for whom is it effective? Is our intervention only being effective for a certain subpopulation? And if so, well, maybe we need to focus more on getting that subpopulation, or maybe we need to say, all right, we're effective here. How can we branch out and increase the range of effectiveness that we have, so we can bring more people into the program's effects, rather than just often what it is we're just hitting a very narrow group of people that it's being effective for, and we don't try and identify these subgroups, those that might be really effective for some people. It might be for other people that it's very ineffective, or as you say, it might even be damaging. And we just have to understand that. My guess is that there's very few programs that are totally ineffective for anybody. That the effect really is truly zero for everybody. It's more likely that what we have is every program is going to be effective for a certain group. The question is, how can we bring more of that group in so we can have a bigger effect for the program, and how can we extend the range of individuals for whom the program is effective? So yeah, it's just absolutely critical to do this kind of work.
Yes. Can I add a few things?
Yeah, I'd like that.
Were you finished, Justin?
No.
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, I think Justin's points are very valid, very very helpful. But just a couple of additional things. Sometimes you may find that the outcomes are positive, and that the intervention has produced some positive outcomes, let's say compared to perhaps fathers who did not attend a program. Maybe there was a randomized control trial or some other type of study, but where there was some comparison, you see that there are some positive outcomes. Well, you also have to ask questions such as, how big was the outcome? How big was the effect of the program? And that's a very important question. A lot of research will show a positive outcome as measured by outcome measures, but it may be a small effect. And so everybody should be asking questions such as how large was the effect. A big effect is very, very different than a small effect of a program. A small effect can occur if you have enough people in the study. If you have thousands and thousands of people or in your study, or maybe 1,000 people in your study, you can generally get some positive, significant effect, but it may be very tiny, it may be very small. So that's one issue. The other thing is that you were asking, Jessica, how do you use these outcomes? Just to give an example from my own research with adolescent fathers, I had conducted a co-parenting intervention with adolescent fathers, and we only worked with the fathers. They came to 5 sessions. This was before the birth of the child, and the focus was on the co-parenting relationship with the mother. The mother was not invited to attend. That was our approach used in this particular study, and there was a control group. What we found was that fathers' perceptions of co-parenting improved, but mothers did not. We didn't see any change in mothers' perceptions of the co-parenting relationship. So what that meant to me, what that told me, was that the program was not effective in changing mothers' perceptions. And when I think about what implication that has for the program, to me it implies that it's really important to involve the mother as well as the father. Okay, so that was just an instance where I was using an outcome measure to learn something about programming.
And that could affect how they go forward and who they target and their plans to engage mothers.
Right, exactly.
Okay. What about data collection issues and outcome measures? How do issues like attrition and dosage, how do those come into play when you measure outcomes, and why? How can we sometimes get an inaccurate read about program effectiveness if there is turnover or data collection isn't as complete or as careful as optimal?
I can jump in just right there. Attrition is a really important thing to think about here. You will probably lose the people that are having the most difficulties, right? That's often the individuals that you lose. And so what's really, but you need to collect data up front in order to know that. So collecting enough data up front on the characteristics of these individuals is really important, so that you can know the characteristics of those that lead the study. And a lot with the lower income non-resident father population, they're a bit more mobile than the rest of the population, and so keeping attrition to a minimum is important, and trying to build in procedures of how you plan on contacting people. Can you get contact information, from the father? But then also, is there a family member who you can have contact information from, who would know where the father is, and you can get that from the father as well. But just doing all you can to try and track these individuals is really important, because the attrition does become a serious issue. In some of my research with this kind of population, it really is hard to keep people over 6 months, over a year. Sometimes it's the incentive right off. If they see that you are going to actually give them some money for this, and that they can expect on getting some more later, that's helpful in keeping people. But collecting that information up, all the information, background characteristics you can on the individuals, and then using that to predict attrition. People with characteristics are likely to leave the sample, and so you can then actually control for that in your statistical analyses. So take that information, try and understand what are the characteristics of individuals that leave the study, and then actually use that information in your models to try and adjust for that. If you don't know why people are leaving, then you can't adjust for it. It makes it really difficult. So collecting all that information up front to try and be able to identify why it is that people leave is really important. And then creating your procedures in such a way that you try and get as many to stay as possible, because it's a great point, Jessica. That could become a really serious issue for some of these evaluations.
Right. Rebecca, do you have any tricks on reducing attrition or anything more you've done? You've been chasing a lot of fathers.
Well, as I mentioned before, I think Facebook is a wonderful tool that if programs can have a page set up to make contact with fathers via Facebook, it can be really useful. Essentially, you would potentially friend the father through the organization's Fatherhood webpage, and then you could message the father through the system if at some point one of his numbers is not working, or if you lose track of where he is, or if he stops coming to group. The Facebook system allows you to contact that father at any time, and even if fathers may not have a working number, they may be checking their Facebook regularly, so that can be useful. Jessica, we just had someone write a question to me via email. They're having trouble asking a question through the system, and if you don't mind, I'll read it aloud. This is from Kristen Harknett. She writes, I have a question about father-child contact. Have you thought about distinguishing between contact with the mother present and contact outside of mother's presence and outside of mother's home? It seems like it might be important to distinguish when father-child contact is contingent on the relationship with the mother and when the father-child contact can take place even if the mother and father don't spend time with one another.
Well, that is a great point, Kristen. I don't know if you're on the line, Kristen, but I'd love to hear your thoughts about that.
She is. Would you like me to grab her?
Yeah, I think Kristen.
Okay, Kristen, go ahead.
I would love to hear more of what you're thinking. I think that's a fascinating and really important point that you're making, and it. But please go ahead.
Well, it's something that, I don't know, can people hear me?
Yes.
Okay, terrific. So we've been thinking about it for the Building Bridges and Bonds study, and we've come up with a couple of ideas for how we might get at that when we're asking about father engagement and how often he spent time reading to kids and doing other things with kids. We imagined you could ask a parallel question about how often do you spend time with the child in your own home? And then among a set of questions asking about father-child contact, just asking how often do you see the child in the home where the child lives, things like that. But I just wondered if you had given that any thought about trying to make that distinction.
We did not develop our measures with those things in mind, but I'm really interested to kind of maybe learn more about that and explore that. I think it would be fascinating. It immediately brings me to think about the co-parenting issue, because co-parenting can take place with a mother present. So in other words, you can be in contact with the child as a sort of a triad, the three of you together, and we know that's an important form of involvement between fathers and children. Mm-hmm. So I think that's just a fascinating, really worthwhile thing to explore. But we did not really take that into mind. Rebecca, is that correct? I don't think we really were thinking about that so much when we developed our contact measure. I would love to see something, if you have some measures that you develop.
So you're trying to see about contact that might occur in mom's home, in the other parent's father's home, in a third-party home, and maybe in a supervised setting. Those would be 4 different types of settings in which it could occur, right?
Well, it could also occur in the community.
In a community, right. Right. Visiting children in a park or a playground or something like that.
I mean, that's an important form of contact because oftentimes fathers just run into their children in the neighborhood.
Right.
Yes, I think it sort of, brings to light sort of what the context is of the father's involvement, and I think it would be fascinating, really important to see how that, where it does contact in one type of setting increase versus another type of setting. There may be some implications for programs there too.
Yeah.
So,
okay, thank you.
Great question.
Thank you. And our next question comes from Elias Jones. Please state your question.
Yeah, so since we're back with the co-parenting, you guys had expressed before how the mother's input would be great for a measurement or some type of survey that would be put in place that kind of speaks to how the mothers feel that the father is involving with that child. So what kind of questions, if so, if you guys may know of, that you guys might have asked in those surveys to kind of figure out whether that father involvement was there?
Right. So I think the question, Elias, is about the co-parenting relationship, the mother-father co-parenting relationship.
Yes.
And what type of questions we would be asking to address co-parenting. Is that correct?
Right.
Okay.
Yes.
So some of the sort of categories of questions that we ask are, number one, support. Does the mother support the father? Does the father support the mother in terms of their parenting role, in terms of their parenting? So it's not just support in any aspect of one's life, but support related to the parental role, to parenting. Right?
Yes.
So that's one issue. The other is gatekeeping and gate opening. Right? Now, both mothers and fathers can engage in both of those. Right? So, for instance, a father could prevent a mother from being involved with a child, and vice versa. The mother could prevent the father, but they also could facilitate each other's involvement. So there's the gate opening and gatekeeping. Then undermining. Okay, we know that parents can undermine each other. Right? And there are different types of questions. Our particular measure, I think we have 3 items that addresses the extent to which parents undermine each other. And then, help me out, Rebecca, I'm trying to remember all of our...
Agreement?
Agreement. Do they agree about how children should be raised?
And conflict.
Right. And conflict, yes, thank you. So how much conflict is it? Do they argue? Are they arguing with each other? Do they say mean things about each other in terms of their roles as parents?
Okay.
So does that give you a sense of the kind of question?
No, that was excellent. Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you. And our next question comes from Brianna Lenman from Howard University. Please state your question. Brianna, you're on live. There you are. Go ahead, please.
Yes. Hi. I actually have 2 questions. Hold on 1 second. Sorry. Okay. My first question is going back to the new co-parenting measure that you mentioned earlier. And I was wondering what the underlying conceptualization of the new measure might be in terms of whether extended family members are included, such as grandmothers and girlfriends and others that fall outside of our typical conceptualization of the mother being the only co-parent. In my experience, extended family members have a huge impact on the father's involvement and co-parenting dynamics. So I'm just wondering how that concept is defined and whether those individuals are considered.
Right, and there is some new literature in that area. Dr. Deborah Jones's work in that area is just wonderful. Rebecca, do you want to take that on?
Sure. We actually developed an experimental measure which assesses kind of the co-parenting group, as you mentioned, folks outside of the biological mother who take responsibility for raising and caring the child. The co-parenting measure that will be released in early February does particularly just look at the co-parenting relationship between the biological mother and the father attending the Fatherhood program. So it doesn't take into account those other co-parents who may be very actively involved. The other measure that we kind of exploratorily are looking into the data at this point, we won't have in February, but we may release later depending upon the results.
And that includes... And who does that include?
So that includes the father's acknowledged co-parents. So the father has the option of identifying various co-parents. They may be family members, or they may be relatives, or they may be friends who he perceives himself to co-parent with.
Or other mothers.
Correct.
And I have one more question, which is something that I'm kind of facing right now in terms of evaluation. Is there was, when we were talking earlier about the RFP that's recently come out, I noticed that it was listed there that the teams of individuals that will be applying must be composed of both fatherhood practitioners and researchers. However, oftentimes practitioners may not necessarily involve researchers, and they sort of take on the whole evaluation process in isolation of researchers and without sort of having the knowledge of research. And so what would your advice be in approaching the situation where this has happened and various measures have been utilized over time to capture information, and there's not sort of that situation that allows for this pre-post comparison? How do you approach handling a variety of data and sort of salvaging that data in a way that gives somewhat of a cohesive picture of what the program is doing?
Jessica, do you want to?
Well, this is with respect to submitting a new application, with responding to the RFP, or doing a salvage job on data that's been collected that isn't of the best quality, perhaps, and trying to milk out something useful. I'm not sure which one you're asking about.
Well, it's not necessarily in response to the RFP, but just overall, generally speaking.
Well, it goes back to the challenge of building a partnership between programs and researchers, and it is a trust-building process of programs, practitioners in many areas, struggle for funding and support, and they fear sometimes researchers, those that are outside, don't understand their population, or they're protective of their population. They're worried about inconclusive or even negative kinds of findings, or less than glowing outcomes. Those are some of the trust issues that come up to play in a lot of settings, not only fatherhood programs, but other practitioner settings where populations are difficult to assess and have a lot of challenges. I think it's trying to convince them, hear enough, listen to them enough about their programs and what they're trying to accomplish and their hopes and their challenges, and making them feel comfortable that you get it, that you understand their situation, and you're not going to be insensitive to the data collection constraints and research constraints of their situation. Jay, do you want to add more about?
Yeah, I would just say that in terms of building and starting a new evaluation study where you're going to be designing a study and collecting data and looking at outcomes, a strong partnership is really critical in this type of research. the researcher, these are tremendously challenging studies to do, and the researcher and practitioner have to work together to problem solve. I mean, there's got to be a lot of problem solving as the project develops to figure out how best to, make sure that there's good data collection, that there isn't too much attrition, that people are attending the program, and just doesn't work without a strong partnership. In terms of, we're looking for sort of rigorous studies to a large extent. So if you're looking at prior data that's already been collected, my suggestion would be to look at the quality of the data first. If it's low quality data, it may not not suffice in terms of a proposal. Right, Jessica?
Yes. It can be suggestive. You can mention that, but then you can probably talk about how you will improve the quality of data collection going forward and use it as instructive rather than conclusive. I think we're coming to the end of our time, so I want to thank you for coming. I want to remind you that this has been recorded so that if you want to go back or refer someone else to this webinar, it is posted on the FRPN website. We'd love to get feedback from you about this and webinar and also others of interest. We've been doing them kind of quarterly, so expect another one in the next 3 months. In about 3 months, and we'll be sending out a survey monkey to ask for other webinar ideas and to give us more feedback. Look at the RFP. Let other people know about it, both programs and researchers. If you need help getting matched up, contact us. We do have a listserv that we can use to help connect interested researchers and practitioners in different parts of the country who may not know about one another. And please do apply. It's a letter of interest, only 3 pages, and we'll give you feedback and invite full applications. We're going to be giving out more awards than we did in round 1, so chances are better. And we want to build the knowledge base in the fatherhood field. So you're welcome to join us with that. Thank you again for participating. Is there anything else that our operator needs to mention, or?
No, that's it. Thank you, Jessica. And once again, ladies and gentlemen, this does conclude today's teleconference. We thank you for your participation. You may disconnect your lines at this time and have a great day.